Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for October 20th, 2023. It's Friday, and I'm going to take your questions. I have a lot of questions that have been coming in, and many of them revolve around the issues behind the current war unfolding between Israel and the Palestinians over Gaza, Ukraine, what's happening there, what's up with Biden. What about Trump and his support for Netanyahu, two-state solution, all these questions, and there are too many to take up individually. But what I want to try and do is to put together a picture of things that have to be investigated if you're going to speak confidently about how to oppose the war hawks and the corporate cartels that are pushing for more and more war. Now, last night, Biden gave a national address where he tied together the Hamas and Putin as two desperate despots who have to be defeated. And he basically said, we must stand together against them. We cannot fail to support Ukraine or Israel. Now, putting the Israel in there is a very clever way of forcing Republican conservatives who are opposing the war funding for Ukraine to bring them back in line. So the $100 billion package that Biden proposed includes $10 billion for Israel, includes a little bit of money for China, which appeals to Republican war hawks, as well as Democratic war hawks, a little bit of money for the border, which is an attempt to sweeten the pot for the Republicans, and then the bulk of the rest of it for the Ukraine war. So let's take a look at this by raising some questions that get to the whole story that you have to look at if you're going to effectively fight it. The question of causality. Who can act to shape history? We know on the one side, the so-called elites, the establishment, the oligarchs, the corporate cartels, they have their policies, they have their commitment. They've basically run the world since World War II, and especially since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Or the people. Can the people do something to intervene to shape history in such a way that benefits the majority of people on the planet? Now, we have to answer these questions before another $100 billion is committed with the intent to kill millions more in these banker and corporate cartel wars. So let's start with the situation behind Biden's address last night. The New York Times reported on October 6th that after the ouster of McCarthy, there was a great fear, Speaker Kevin McCarthy, there was a great fear that the U.S. is running out of funds to carry out the Ukraine war. Out of the $113 billion initially allocated, only about $6 billion remain. And that this is at a point at which we're seeing the failed expectation of the so-called counteroffensive, and yet we're still seeing the official policy being we're going to fund Ukraine as long as it takes. So there's growing opposition to funding Ukraine. And that had a lot to do with the ouster of McCarthy, because McCarthy tried to push through a budget and he needed support from conservative Republicans, and he promised them he would deal with the deficit and that he would not support money for Ukraine. And then he, according to Matt Gaetz, turned around and did a secret deal with the Biden administration to have a separate funding bill for Ukraine after the budget, in which the supplemental budget was passed without the $24 billion that Biden had requested. So McCarthy was ousted. So now, is that money going to be available or not? That's the fear among the global war hawks who intend to continue the war to try to defeat or weaken Russia for the purposes of maintaining the United States as the sole superpower. So that's one factor, the running out of funds for Ukraine. Secondly, growing opposition to Netanyahu in Israel. You may not remember this, but just 6 weeks ago, there were hundreds of thousands of Israelis marching in the streets against the so-called judicial reforms of Netanyahu, reforms which had one purpose: to stop his corruption trial from forcing him out as prime minister. But at the same time, you had escalation of the settlers movement rampaging through Palestinian communities. Ben-Gvir, the national security advisor to Netanyahu, leading a group into the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is an explicit and well-known provocation. The cleansing of the territories of Palestinians, all of this was underway. Now, interestingly, even with the unity cabinet and the war cabinet in Israel, you have demands that Netanyahu leave, although they're now saying, win this war, then leave. But the Israeli press is exposing the fact that Netanyahu was an advocate for building up Hamas against the Palestinian Authority as a way of preventing there from becoming a two-state solution. So you have, on the one hand, the Ukraine war fizzling out, a potential political disaster for the Biden administration. You have Netanyahu facing growing opposition. Third, you have economic shocks hitting worldwide, and in the midst of that, a growing movement to get away from the dollar control, the weaponization of the dollar against countries, and a move toward a multilateral trade and economic investment system around the BRICS, around the Belt and Road Initiative, and especially a move to end colonialism. Now, I would argue that Israel's control over Palestinian territories is a form of colonialism, just as the French presence in Niger, which just ended this last week, was another aspect of the new colonialism. That is, the global north looting the global south, and now increasingly looting its own population to protect a debt bubble that cannot be protected. It's ultimately going to blow. So that's adding to the desperation of the establishment and how to deal with things. Now, one final point. The collapse of support for the governments of Western Europe and the United States. People like Trudeau in Canada is polling somewhere around 5 or 8%. If you had an honest poll, it's hard to find a supporter for him, except from the likes of Chrystia Freeland, who basically wants to use him to continue to fund Ukrainian Nazis. Trudeau is collapsing. The Sunak government has no support. Macron is minority support. The governing coalition in Germany has no support. It's around 34% for the three parties in the coalition. Biden, according to the polls, is at 40%, 40+%. But then polls come out that show as many as 2/3 of all Democrats don't want him to run for re-election. So there's no support for any of these governments. They've failed on economic policies. They failed on strategic policies. So you put these 4 points together. The collapse of support for Ukraine at a point at which the Ukrainian military is exhausted, and the war should be ended by negotiations, but they're insisting on keeping it going. Secondly, Netanyahu's collapse in support. Third, the emergence of the BRICS as a multipolar order to replace the unipolar order. And fourth, the collapse of the political support for the existing governments. Now, what can we say about this, putting that together? I would argue that Hamas, by its attack into Israel, gave an early Christmas present, or you might say an early Hanukkah present, to the war hawks, who insist that there be more funding for these wars and that the status quo be maintained. That's what we see in Biden's speech last night. By saying that the fight against Putin in Ukraine is the same as the fight against Hamas in Israel, was designed to swing the hardline Republican opposition to the Ukraine war to endorse the package, the $100 billion package for both of these wars. This is what Chuck Schumer said. He said, this way we can get this thing through. Ben Cardin, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, said the same thing. We have to move quickly, and this will help us do it. So you have this as a factor then. How do we get the policy through? Use the legitimate horror at what happened with the Hamas invasion into Israel as a pretext to get all the money to continue the wars and to sustain the governments that are running out of support. So it's not a conspiracy theory. Those are a series of actual events which add up to a defining set of understanding the intent of the people in power. Now, then you look at the other aspect of it. Why did this happen? Why did Hamas succeed in breaking out of containment and carry out the attacks inside Israel? Well, we're told it was an intelligence failure. Now, let's take a quick look at this question of intelligence failures. Remember Gulf of Tonkin? Turns out that was an intelligence failure that paved the way for a massive deployment of more than 500,000 U.S. troops to Vietnam, with almost 60,000 coming back in body bags. And no one knows for sure how many millions of Vietnamese and Cambodians and Laotians were killed. Supposedly an intelligence failure. How about the 1973 Yom Kippur War? The argument that the Israelis were caught off guard by Syria, Egypt, and Jordan, which led to a scramble of the Israeli Defense Forces to win back the territories from the 1967 war. More importantly, it provoked the Arab oil embargo, which was used by Kissinger to bail out the financial system by having the petrodollars deposited in Western banks. Another intelligence failure? Well, it changed the nature of the world economy from the pre-1971 Bretton Woods system fixed exchange rate to a floating exchange rate system that was funded by you're paying more money for gas at the pump. That was the Kissinger plan. How about 9/11? Was that an intelligence failure? Well, if you listen to the stories about George Tenet, you listen to the reports that Bush was notified in August of 2001 that there was something coming. Nothing was done. We still have not gotten the full explanation of what happened. But again, they talk about the intelligence failure. And then this 2 weeks ago, the intelligence failure of the Israeli intelligence, which is deeply embedded into every fabric of Palestinian life, missing the preparations for a deployment of that scale and an attack into Israel. It's a little hard to believe, but it seems like there's a pattern there which should be investigated. Intelligence failures pave the way for wars. So shouldn't we learn something from these repeated intelligence failures? If nothing else, why do we trust the intelligence agencies that put them out, such as the Russiagate story and so on? So what we're dealing with is a means by which a state of war can be continued as a permanent policy, even as it drives down living standards for people throughout the so-called developed sector. Now, in this context, let me bring up one other aspect of this. You look at the discussion of Schumer, Cardin, and others about how the proposal to lump these wars together will get support for it. Whatever happened to Donald Trump and his statements against Netanyahu? He had been speaking recently about how Netanyahu had a failure, that Netanyahu didn't do what he had to do, and that's why the attack took place. Then all of a sudden he pivots. He's the greatest friend Israel ever had. We have to fully support what the Israelis are doing. Now, I don't purport to know what's going on in Donald Trump's head, but I know one thing. This undermines his credibility as an anti-war figure. He had been critical of Biden's war in Ukraine, as he called it. But remember, Donald Trump was involved in sending funds to Ukraine as well. The question here is not Trump per se, but it's how these things are used to manipulate public opinion, to pull the politicians into line. Now, another case of this sort is Robert Kennedy Jr., who people thought was a sincere opponent of the war machine. And he certainly spoke like that when it comes to Ukraine. But all of a sudden we hear that he's a rabid advocate of support for Israel's policy of attacks on Hamas and on the Gaza. So what we see is that there are no serious contenders for president who oppose these wars or who can't be pulled into them. And in this case, we see that I think we should see, it gives us some answers as to why Donald Trump didn't move more aggressively in taking on the deep state after he had promised to do so as a candidate in 2016. So, and by the way, his bragging about taking out Soleimani, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard leader, poses the whole question of whether Trump would look kindly on a U.S. involvement against Iran on behalf of Israel in this current war. So this brings up the question, what has to be done about this? Well, the most important thing is that the people have to come back to play a role in history. Most of the time, people allow the so-called leaders to make the policy. And you may bitch and moan about it, but ultimately you pay your taxes and you go along with it. That can't be tolerated anymore. The first thing you have to do is get the facts, and the facts come not as single isolated turds produced by the intelligence community, but in the context of history. You need to know the history. The events in Ukraine don't start in February 2022. The war in Gaza didn't start in October 2023. These things have a history of manipulation from above. That's what the British Empire has done historically, to use wars to cover their control of the empire. And that's what the unipolar order, the so-called rules-based order, is doing today to maintain its control. So first, understand history, study it, think philosophically. Don't allow yourself to be manipulated on the basis of emotions. Human emotions exist, they are important, but they can be played, as all of you know. The other thing then is we have to find a way to get out of the cycle of violence. Revenge may satisfy a need for a certain aspect of completion, but it's not completion. When you take out an act of vengeance against someone else, you're paving the way for a follow-up act against you. And that's clear from the history of the last 2 centuries, if not from all of human history. And so what we've proposed is that the approach has to be to go back to the principle of Westphalia. I'm going to be appending 2 things to the description page of the briefing today, one of which is the leaflet, Westphalia, not Versailles. Take these questions seriously. As I said, this is not a dive into conspiracy theory. It's an understanding of human history from the standpoint of at least the last 200 years and the vested interests that are involved. When you have corporate cartels that are funding or putting money into the pockets of billionaires, they're not going to give that up. And they're all over the control of governments and the policy making and the funding of universities and think tanks to crank out these proposals for how to sustain the unipolar order. The Schiller Institute is one of the most important counters to that groupthink. So join us, work with us, and don't despair. As long as there's hope in human beings,